this video, we're going to take a look at Distributed File System on Windows 2012 R2. Distributed File System, or DFS for short, is a way for us to combine our file shares across multiple servers, and especially in a domain environment. This is going to allow us some fault tolerance, some site awareness, and some redundancy. It also improves performance. So if we have a file share on server 1, and we also have a file share on server 2, and we want them to be identical, we can use DFS to synchronize those automatically. Changes can occur on either of our two servers, and those changes will get synchronized automatically. If one server fails, clients will be redirected to the other server. Also, if server 1 happens to be at one physical location, and server 2 is at another physical location, DFS can take advantage of Active Directory's sites and allow clients on one site to connect to the local server on their site, and clients on the other site can connect to the local server on their site. So it does improve performance and takes advantage of a couple of Active Directory features to improve our WAN utilizations. So here's what we're going to do. First thing we need to do is we need to install DFS. Now you may notice when you do a fresh install of Windows 2012 R2, the File and Storage Services role is already installed. Now we're going to go into that role, we're going to add an additional component of that role, and right down here in File and Storage Services, inside the File and iSCSI services, there is DFS namespaces, and this is going to bring along the administrative tools as well, and DFS replication. We're going to use both of these features in order to synchronize our data between these two servers. Now, keep in mind, you're going to need to do this process, installing the additional File and Storage Services role services. You're going to need to do that on both servers. We'll say next and continue through the wizard. We don't need to add any more features other than those that come along with the role, and we'll install that. And this might take just a minute. When that installation completes, you'll get the installation succeeded message. You probably won't need to reboot because this isn't a service that typically changes something underneath the surface and requires a kernel restart. So we can close that out, and remember, install this both on server 1 and server 2. I've already installed it on server 2, so we can move on to the next step. Under Tools, you'll now have a DFS management utility. This utility is going to allow you to manage and set up replication between these two servers, as long as they already have file shares that are ready to go. We'll start up this utility, and there's going to be two components that we see in here. There's a namespaces component and a replication component. Now I'm going to be working with two servers that happen to belong to an Active Directory domain. I have a domain called domain01.local. This is server 1, and this one's server 2. So I don't have any namespaces yet, and I don't have any replication set up yet. I'm going to do all of this from scratch. But the first thing I need to do is I need to create some file shares that are going to synchronize between these two servers. So I'm going to open File Explorer and open my C drive, and I'm going to create a new folder. Right click, choose New, and Folder. And I'm going to call this Finance Files. And I need to set this up as a share. So I'll go into Properties, and I'm going to verify some permissions. And in this case, even though these are finance files, I'm going to share this folder out just with everyone, just so that I can have an example here to show you. Of course, you should set proper permissions and use groups and all that good stuff. And I'm going to make sure that users can modify files as well. Again, this is pretty open security. You'll want to tighten down your security on your own system. So we have finance files, and as you know, you can access a Windows share by using the //server/share style. So now I've server 1. Let's try that again. Got to type the right server name in there. So on my network, // server1 / finance files. The folder's empty, it's brand new, there's nothing in there yet. And this tells any client from any machine, I want to talk to server 1 and I want to access the share named finance files. And within there we might have a file. We'll call it finance data. This is the finance data. So now I have a file with some data in there. And this is just really for us to use as an example. And it is networkable. So if I were to access that file share from over here, server 1 finance files, I should be able to look at that file share. And there's my data. Now, that's all fine and good, except what happens if server 1 fails? If server 1 fails, server 2 or any of my other clients are not going to be able to access that data. So what we want is we want some redundancy. We want two servers being able to share this same data at once. It's going to really improve our uptimes. The other thing we want to do is we want to make sure that server 1 isn't overburdened with all of the network client accesses. We want to make sure that we can balance the load maybe between two servers. So that's what we're going to do here with DFS. Going back over to server 2, let's create a share over there as well. And for your own sanity, I recommend using the same names and the same permissions on both sides. If you don't use the same permissions on both sides, you can run into some trouble. Because remember, clients don't necessarily need to access an individual server's data. What they're going to do instead is they're going to talk to the entire DFS space. And they're going to say, DFS, point me to the data. And DFS is going to, behind the scenes, find the right server for you. Now, if those servers don't have the same permissions, we could run into some trouble. So it's always a good idea to make sure your permissions are identical. It's worth double checking. So now I have a share on server 2. I have a server 2 finance files. Notice it's not the same. Finance data is not there. That's because this is a completely separate and isolated share. It could have its own data, and it could even have the same files with different versions of those files, and that's no good. So even if we tried to do some kind of manual synchronization, we need to make sure we have a service in place where Windows is going to take care of it for us, and it's going to synchronize that information. That's where DFS comes in. Let's make sure everything in here is always equivalent to everything in here. We can go back to DFS now, and we can create our first namespace. Now a namespace is going to be a share of its own, but it's going to be a domain-wide share. So I'm going to create a new namespace. I need to choose a server to host the namespace on. I'm going to use server 1. And now I need the name for a namespace. Well, what should I name my namespace? Here's some examples up here as far as how that is going to actually play out. Normally our UNC path, our Universal Naming Convention, says / server / name, or the share name. Kind of like server 1 finance files. What we're going to do now with DFS is we're going to be / domain / namespace name. What this allows for is we can point to a whole collection of servers within our domain, and we can point to this new share that we're creating. So I'm going to just name mine namespace, so that when we see this play out, we'll know that we're working with a namespace. Now, you'll probably want to name this something a little bit more applicable to what this namespace is going to be used for. So now I'll say next, and I'm going to choose the domain-based namespace. You're going to find that the domain-based namespace has all the features that you're going to want, including the automatic replication, the failover, and all of those pieces, the site awareness. So you're probably going to want to stick with the domain-based namespace. It's a little harder to come up with a compelling reason why to use a standalone namespace. So this is the preview of my domain-based namespace. / domain01.local / namespace. It's a UNC path, just like the ones we used over here. but now it's a little different. We're also going to leave enabling Windows Server 2008 mode on. Unless you have some compelling reason for backwards compatibility, you're going to be happy with that. As it says here, when created in Windows Server 2008 mode, the namespace supports increased scalability and access-based enumeration. So we want as good of features as we can get, and as long as you're not using something prior to Windows Server 2008, you'll probably want to enable that mode. We can say create, and it creates the namespace. While that's running, we can actually see that happening here in the background. If we go to our C drive, a new folder gets created for us, DFS roots. And then there's our namespace. And what this is going to do is it's going to create this as a share, and it's going to share that out with all of the shortcuts to the other shares that we're going to put in there. So the namespace was created successfully. We can say close. Now remember, this is domain wide, so this will be accessible from any DFS management utilities. You don't have to connect right to your server to do DFS management work. You can connect from your own client machine as long as you have the DFS management administrative tool installed. Now we're not done. We actually haven't tied anything to this namespace. If I were to surf to that namespace, / domain 01.local / namespace, oops, 91, we'll go 01. Okay, so there's our path, our UNC path, domain 01.local / namespace. There's nothing in there. It's a share, it's a domain level share, but I haven't tied in any of my folders. I haven't put any of my folders in there yet. So that's what I do next. I can create a new folder within that. Now it seems like, well, I could just right click over here and add in folders, but what we want to do is we want to manage everything at this higher level within DFS management. So we say new folder, and we're going to say finance files. And I'm going to add in my server 1 finance files share. Notice that your namespace is going to look like this. Your domain, your namespace, and then your share. So it will be one layer deeper, but that's going to be okay because you can put all of the shares in your entire domain into this if you wanted to. And then your users never need to know which server they really reside on. The other nice thing about it is that if you need to move servers behind the scenes, maybe phase out an older server and bring in a new server, their UNC paths don't have to change, just because the names of the servers hosting those behind the scenes may change. So now I'm going to add in a folder target. A folder target is a shared folder that I want to include in my DFS. So the one I want to include is server 1 finance files. Notice it's not case sensitive. I will advise to avoid spaces in your UNC paths. For the most part, it will make your life a little bit easier to avoid spaces, especially when you're using batch files or any time where a space happens to be a delimiter. Avoid it. It's just going to make your life easier. Okay. We say OK to this, and now we have this shortcut to finance files. If I go back to my namespace, you'll even see that if I browse to it, I'll have this shortcut to finance files. And within there is finance data. So what happens is I connect to my namespace. It reroutes me to the proper server hosting that data, and it points me to that share. And there's my finance data file. I'm still not done, because what I want to do is I want to synchronize this finance files folder on server 2 as well. So now what I can do for this folder, if I click on the folder, I have one target for that folder. I have the server 1 finance files target. So whenever you go to finance files in your namespace, the target of that redirection is going to be this path. Well, what if we add in 2 targets? That's where our replication can happen. I'm going to add a folder target, and now I'm going to add in server 2 finance files. And now I have a second target. Now this can get a little tricky because now DFS is saying you can use server 1 or you can use server 2. And when we do that, we can set up a replication group to keep these folder targets synchronized. Do you want to create one? Highly advise it. There's almost no case where you wouldn't want to do this, because what we're doing now is we're saying there's two possibilities here. We want those two possibilities to always be the same. So yes, we want to create a new replication group. Takes just a second here, and you can see some of the details of what we're doing. We're collecting the information about the folders on server 1 and on server 2, and we're just making sure that everything is aligned. Now, at this point, we can create a replication group. It jumps us right into this wizard. The replicate folder wizard will create a replication group name, and it's named by default the UNC path of that folder. So here's my replication group name and my replicated folder name. It's already picked those for me, so I'm going to leave these defaults. And these are the two locations where that data really exists. Now, right now, you'll remember, server 1 has data in it, server 2 does not. So we need to synchronize that data. And we can choose who has the master copy of that data right here. Who's the primary member of this replication group? Server 1. Because server 1 is the state in which we want to begin from. Doesn't matter what server 2 has, we want server 1 to be the copy that replicates out to our servers. Next, we have an option with regards to the topology of our replication. My example here is very simple. I have two servers that want to have the same information. So topology doesn't really come into play. Obviously, there's a connection between server 1 and server 2. There's no structured or tiered replication happening here, so there's no need to change our topology. If you have a complex environment, maybe with a headquarters and multiple branch offices, you may want to choose a hub and spoke type of topology. A change happens at a branch office, you don't want that branch office necessarily copying to every other branch office. You may want to copy it up to headquarters and then distribute out, and that's where your hub and spoke option would come into play. Now obviously you will need at least 3 members in your replication group for that to come into play. So in our case we can't even do that. With 2 servers, a full mesh is appropriate. And then we have some choices with regards to how replication will happen. When do we want replication to happen, and how much bandwidth are we going to allow for replication? You can set any of these predefined amounts, and this can be nice. If you're in the middle of a workday and somebody changes a lot of changes in a really big file, it will attempt to replicate that data so that everybody has that current copy. You might want to be careful though, because you could very easily use up your full network bandwidth. So oftentimes it's appropriate to throttle this back and make sure it doesn't take up all of your network bandwidth. In my case, I'm going to use full bandwidth because server 1 and server 2 happen to be on the same LAN segment, which makes things very fast. And I have plentiful bandwidth. If I were using a slower WAN link, or at least one that I don't want to saturate with replication traffic, I might choose something slower. And you can also choose specific days and times. Maybe it's only necessary to replicate overnight when everyone goes home from work. You can choose to do that here. I'm going to leave the full continuous replication on for my example. Here's my summary. You can review all of your settings. The thing to make sure of most is to make sure that your primary folder target is set right. The last thing you want to do is take the wrong copy and copy it over the good copy. The process should go pretty quickly. And we can say close. Replication will not begin until the configuration is picked up by the members. So this can take some time. We need to make sure that Active Directory replicates out to these other servers. So this can take some time before this kicks in. Don't be alarmed if you jump right over to your second server and the data hasn't copied yet. So just expect that it might take some time. Let's check that out. Here's server 2's data, and even a refresh here does not show my data has arrived yet. And that's okay. We just need to be aware that it might not be immediate. But before too long, server 1 will copy its data over to server 2. It took a minute or two for server 2 to recognize that it had some work to do here, but now you'll see that the file did come over, and now I have the file on both sides, on the server 1 side as well as on the server 2 side. And that will live in the local file system, so just keep in mind you will need space on both servers for all of this data, as well as some extra space for staging. And by staging I mean getting files ready to replicate when they need to go from one side to the other. So now, anytime I want, I can use the domain01.local \namespace. I can use this DFS path, and when I go into finance files, it doesn't matter which server I'm really connecting to as far as how this path works. It'll connect to whichever server's closer or whichever server's available. So now I have complete replication, and anything I add on one side will replicate to the other. And now that both servers know what they're doing as far as being on the same page with their replication group, anything I add to one should almost immediately pop over into the other server. So there shouldn't be much lag on a LAN because of the replication topology settings that I chose. So that's DFS in a nutshell. It gets a little more complex when you are using WAN links, but not much. You just need to manage your bandwidth a little bit better.